again. Stormzy will not be making an appearance. I need to stop putting these images there because they're deceiving. And as you can see, I've got no stereotypical views of feminism with his bright pink jacket on either. I have been in talks with Adidas though. We're going to get some pink Adidas jackets at some point. Nice. That's how we're going to end sexist oppression, no doubt. Joke's over. This event is obviously going to touch on a little bit of sensitive subject matter, and it is a little bit experimental, so do forgive us if we make mistakes. These glamorous people either side of me are all men, and that decision wasn't random. It was kind of made after a lot of thoughtful conversations, and we are specifically discussing men's role in feminism and what we can do to support it. It's also with the acknowledgement that women have put in quite a lot of emotional labor to these discussions already and have been imploring men to do it for quite a long time. I think it's also quite a nice opportunity for women and other people to observe an unfiltered conversation amongst men on this subject matter as well, with the opportunity for them to respond. Another analogy that I've been using is that I would be like the first person to go see like a bunch of white people talk about their role in white supremacy. I think that would be quite a powerful thing, and I think it is important for people with privilege to discuss their privilege in a lot of cases. And we will also aim to have like more diverse panels in the future. And I think we also need to prove that men can discuss this subject matter maturely as well. I don't just want to drop people in the deep end or use any like tokenistic values. But that's enough from me. Would you lot like to do a brief introduction of who you are, why this conversation is important, and what your thoughts on it are?
You start with me?
Why not?
Okay, mic check, check. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. All right, loud and proud, fantastic. So my name's Adom Philogene Heron. I am an anthropologist by training, a social anthropologist. In other words, I explore various different cultures around the world with a special interest in the Caribbean and a particular interest in Caribbean masculinities and fatherhood. So that's what I did my PhD on. I now work at Goldsmiths, where I teach in the anthropology department. You'll learn more about me in the course of the discussion as we kind of unburden our hearts in the course of this conversation. But I'm a Bristol native, grew up, born and bred, as much as my accent don't really give it away. But yeah, I'll hand over to D-Dash.
Hello, yep. Yeah, my name is Delano. I'm an undergraduate in anthropology archaeology. I run a little podcast called Ragtag Renaissance, where we have a lot of discussions around pretty much everything, but always through the kind of analytical lens of race, gender, and culture. Yeah.
My name is Oluwatosin Adegoke. People know me as Peter, to be fair. I am an undergrad in philosophy, and I'm really just here to try and talk about the concept of feminism. And yeah, that's what I'm about.
Hello, I'm Marcus. I'm a youth worker, mentor and therapist. I mostly work with young men, and yeah, it's really interesting me to kind of think about these ideas. I'm trying to kind of express them to young men a lot in my work, so that's why I'm excited to be here.
Cool. A lot of my views on this whole subject matter are actually out there already. I made an article about this subject matter, so I won't go on too much right now. I do just want to leave us all with a little quote to hang over us while we have the discussion. Not like my dissertation quote that took about 10 minutes to recite last time. But it's one from Andrea Dworkin, and she was like quite a big radical feminist in the 60s. And it's just quite powerful. Goes as so. Have you ever wondered why us women are not just in armed combat against you men? It's not because there's a shortage of kitchen knives, it's because we believe in your humanity against all the evidence. I just thought that was quite a powerful quote to throw out there, and yeah. So on to the first point I kind of want to discuss with you guys. As a little backdrop, feminism today is often it's got a lot of stigma around it, but it was also often seen as something equated with a desire for gender equality, women being equal with men in this society. That then begs the question, which men do women want to be equal with? For example, not all men are equal in the society. For example, there's homeless men, there's working class men, there's working class men of color. A lot of radical feminists acknowledge that not all men are equal in the society, and they believe that it's more important to have a wider focus on all forms of oppression. So my question to you guys is, if more men understood that feminism, particularly radical feminism, is not about women achieving equality with men in an unequal system, but about eradicating a system of institutionalized male dominance, racial dominance, capitalist dominance, all forms of unjust dominance, would more men take an interest in it?
Yeah, I find that interesting. That is a good question. I think what is feminism? The premise is a form of systematic subordination, and a lot of people misunderstand the subordination as, say, individual subordination. But what it's really saying is that there is a system which conditionalizes and socializes it, whether it be through, socializes its subjects, whether it be through the education system, through families, through business, through the professional system, whether it be through whatever form of institution, it results in the subordination of women over men subordinating women. So the claim is not that every instance between interacting with a woman is sort of disrespectful or sort of against them, but it's more that you are conditionalized in a certain way to have a certain sort of subordination, to be subject to subordination. So the real critique is to the system, and feminism doesn't really give a crap about the individual instances of disrespect, is the whole point that I'm trying to make. And in doing that, in being a radical feminist, the claim is to completely change the system. In being a liberal feminist, the claim is to change the system within the bounds of the system. So it's really a critique to the system. And so I think that
would men be more interested in it if they knew that?
That is, yeah, good you remind me. I was going on one a bit. Yes, I think it's very tricky for, is it very loud?
No, it's not too loud.
I think it's really tricky for men to interpret their opinion within a critique which seems to suggest that men are necessarily at ends. And in doing that, it makes you feel like there are psychological studies which show that men refuse to identify as feminists. They would rather identify as feminists behind closed doors, so a sort of like tacit agreement. But then the moment that they are questioned whether they are happy to identify as feminists, they sort of immediately reject it. And I think understanding the real core of what the feminist claim is the first steps in understanding how you yourself are being critiqued. Because it's not the individuals that are being critiqued, it's the system.
Yeah, so I would like to say I agree with your point about an understanding of what the claim of feminism is and what it should be. I kind of disagree with what you said in terms of what you said, Elias, in terms of feminism being essentially something that's built to eradicate patriarchy.
Radical feminism specifically.
Okay, radical feminism specifically. Okay, but when we're talking about feminism as a whole, not just radical feminism, that's not the case, historically, of course. So I want to say, first of all, that I don't equate feminism to women's rights. I think it should go without saying that any form of discrimination against anyone is completely wrong. And then, based off that, so if we're going to ask what the question of what feminism is actually going for, if we're looking for historically where the claim of feminism began, it began with white women wanting to have equality with white men, as you mentioned the question at the start, which men do they want to have equality with, and essentially to subjugate other peoples. I think if you look over time, in terms of what historically white womanhood has been, it's been portrayed as something that's morally correct and necessarily pure and right. And I think that's, there's a whole host of reasons for that. And that's not the case. I think there's a lot of erasure of what white womanhood has been responsible for throughout history. I actually think that that if you were to analyze this, and if you were to research this and sort of, as we know, white women were taken out of pictures of lynchings, etc. There was an idea of that we have to preserve white women as what is moral and good. And if you look at what history actually tells us this isn't the case. And so I kind of refute the idea that we need to have feminism for men, for black men specifically. Okay, I think for white women it seems to have worked very well.
What about the thoughts behind feminism? And let's not try, because another disclaimer I want to make is I'd hope we can try and not get too caught up on semantics, because I know there is a lot of stigma attached to the word, but how about the thoughts like dismantling class dominance and racial dominance? Are those not things that you want to get rid of?
I'll let you come back on that one and then I'll jump in.
Okay. So I think a great example of what you're saying is someone like R.W.S. Connell, who came up with the term hegemonic masculinity. I think when we're talking about the ideas behind feminism, again, if we're talking about discrimination against people, it goes without saying that it's not right. And I think there are some individual theorists, radical feminist theorists that make points that tend to not be what is repeated on a kind of ground level, on a populist level. And I think that's another one of the problems. I don't think that passes from, say, R.W.S. Connell. So the idea, for example, hegemonic masculinity or toxic masculinity, the idea that there's such a thing as black patriarchy or black toxic masculinity is pretty much explicitly stated by Connell, who came up with the term that is not the case. There's many black masculinities, that it's far more nuanced than this kind of suggestion. And there are many forms of masculinities that fight against patriarchy. And it's interesting because white masculinities are often allowed these kind of nuances, and often black masculinities are not, and they're sort of typecast in one way. And this is again at the populist sort of level, so not just at where the ideas came from, but if we're talking about today, what turns up in articles like The Root or other kind of publications.
Should we let Adom interject?
Yeah, I just want to reel back a little bit, just to give us a kind of a more of a panoramic view of the discussion, and then we can focus back in again. So often there's a conflation. I think sometimes the aversion on the part of a lot of people to the idea of feminism is that there's a confusion between, on the one hand, the way that you're structurally privileged as a man, and your own individual complicity. Yeah. So you've got this. You're structurally privileged in certain ways by virtue of your comportment, by virtue of having and inhabiting a particular body. It doesn't play out in every in every situation at all times, as was mentioned earlier, but you have that available to you at certain points where it can be drawn upon. Sometimes you might be the only black man in a predominantly white setting, you might be the only black working class man in a predominantly middle class white setting. Those kinds of privileges aren't immediately afforded to you. So it can lead you to the understanding that you never have those privileges at any point in your life. Once we begin to separate those two things, and you begin to see that, okay, sometimes I am complicit in this thing, but I'm also subject to it as well. So patriarchy works on me to make me behave in certain ways. You can begin to critique that system and the power that it has on you, or the way that it affects your lives. So I think that making that distinction between the way you're structurally positioned as a man and then your own complicity in it is an important process in the first instance. And then once you get to that point, then you can begin to say, well, I can critique this system because I'm subject to this system as well. It makes me look at people in my area a certain way, another man, if I don't recognize him in that context, yeah? When you've got all of this stuff that's going on where we stay in London, you're hearing about the number of young boys that are going missing. It's crazy. So you realize that patriarchy is working on those boys in certain ways as well to give them particular ideas of what it means to be a man. Then you come to realize that when you go to call your friend a pussy for some reason, because he hasn't conformed to your idea of what it means to be a man, your expectation of what it means to be a man, it's funny because you realize, okay, now you're becoming complicit. Now you're becoming complicit in something, because to call somebody a pussy, to denigrate women's genitalia, there's a certain irony there because men are so keen to have access to women's genitalia, yet that's the first thing that they want to throw at their friend when they decide that he's not man enough. So that kind of, the ways in which that complicity plays out, that's what I think we need to be attentive to. And I think that's what a kind of an engagement with a feminist discourse will enable us to have access to and to begin to kind of critique and question within ourselves.
Marcus?
Yes, I suppose what I would add is, to go back to the question, is why don't men embrace it? And I think black men particularly can listen to the wisdom of black women who have rejected a lot of forms of feminism. And I think what you're saying is there are sort of feminism which does account for the experiences of black men and can, speaks about racism. And so I think black men should embrace feminism when feminism embraces them and can speak to their experiences and can speak to their experience of racism. And there are lots of feminisms that do, and particularly radical feminism, kind of embraces that experience of black men and welcomes black men. So, yeah, I would say that. Yeah. And in terms of why don't men, so if those critiques were more often put together, a critique of sexism and racism, if they were put together, then I think, more black men would embrace it.
So I think a lot of the times when black masculinity is being discussed by feminism, for a start, I think it's often conceived from a basis of a lot of the time around sort of stereotypes that have existed for a long time in society, anti-black stereotypes, the kind of hyper-sexualization, the essential hyper-masculinity that is bestowed on black men, and a lot of feminist discussions around black masculinity is usually based as when you're kind of conceptualizing the black man as saying that things that he doesn't have, so a lack of power, a lack of symbolic power, a lack of father, lack of employment. And it's very rarely actually analyzing black men as they've been able to define themselves through these lacks. And that's another one of my criticisms of contemporary and a lot of historical writings of feminism. I feel that the kind of mimetic idea that black men aspire to, in fact, the whole mimetic thesis of us kind of trying to impose these colonial gender conceptualizations on black people when we've come from a place, well, a lot of us have come from a place of chattel slavery, where we're actually denied any idea or any concept of identity or gender, it's not logical to kind of just to mirror these sort of things onto ourselves. And I think that's where a lot of feminism, where it applies to black people, goes wrong. And with regards, sorry, I just want to quickly say to what you were saying about privilege, I think for a start, I kind of disagree with the whole discourse around privilege, whether it be white privilege or male privilege. I think it focuses discussion in the wrong place. I think the idea that a privilege is something that you shouldn't have and feel bad for is a bit illogical, and I think the discussion can be structured in a much more logical way. But also, I don't understand how, say if we're talking about black men who are at the bottom of almost every conceivable social denominator, can be seen as having a form of privilege. And I think that discussion actually kind of works against. Yeah, I think it's
on that point. It's interesting.
Can I come back on that one quickly, Elias? Is that all right? Actually,
I'll make two points and then you come straight. But I was just on that. It's just an interesting point. But you mentioned slavery. There is, while men of course face a lot of abuse in slavery, I think there's no sort of debate that black women were sort of raped at epidemic levels during slavery to a level that black men weren't. And that's not necessarily to suggest that rape is worse than being, assaulted in different ways, but would you not say that there was disparity in slavery, how women were treated and how men were treated?
Well, the part of the thing about evidence for people being raped during slavery, it's actually a lot easier to tell that a woman has been raped than a man has been raped. And the idea that black men weren't raped at the same rate isn't based off any research or evidence, that's an intuition. I think it's a dangerous intuition to make because we know that racism itself has a very homoerotic nature, and there's a huge thing about the butt breaking and the castration of black men, and during slavery this was a very common practice. The only way people would know if a black man was raped is if they admitted it or told someone else, or if it was spoken about in an interview, as we mentioned on the episode of Ragtag Renaissance.
Yeah, should we let Adom come back then?
I was going to say, I mean, on that point, I don't think it's a zero-sum game. It doesn't mean that the recognition of the kind of sexual violence that was enacted against women, it doesn't mean that you can't also recognize that being enacted against men. And probably a conversation across those two perspectives would be more useful than kind of saying, no, but it happened to us too, kind of thing. Do you know what I mean? It's almost like I feel like there's part of a certain process about healing the legacies of kind of destructive sexualized violence that have kind of been continued to be perpetuated within places like the Caribbean long after the white people upped and pretty much left or kind of retreated to the kind of the beach resorts basically. On the point of privilege and taking it back to that discussion, it'd probably be useful to offer a kind of a concrete example from my own experience. So I did my fieldwork in Dominica, which is where my mom's side of the family are from. The idea of being a light-skinned male who's very well educated and is single in the Caribbean affords you, excuse me, a lot of privilege. I returned 4 years after my fieldwork, where I was a bachelor, where I was living life as happy as Larry, moving very freely around the island. Interpret that as you will. With my wife returning to the island, and then experiencing and seeing the way in which her body was being regulated in certain ways, particularly as she was pregnant, and the kinds of everyday forms of kind of respectability politics, as is popularly known, that are kind of police women's movement in some ways. I came to realize that my experience of the region and her experience of the region were very, very different. And the kind of stuff around respectability about how a woman should dress, how she should comport herself, how she should constantly be the one who fends off men's advances when men come and talk to them in the street. And if you don't say it in the right kind of way, you're uppity, or copawaison, as they say in Creole. Those kinds of things that a woman has to think about on a daily basis, I could just walk freely as anything past and be completely oblivious to. So I'd say that there are material consequences in a day-to-day basis of that privilege. And if you didn't want to call it privilege, you could call it by another name, but there are particular things which, as much as anything, can be considered a distraction. There's an analogy with racism there as well. Somebody said to me that, and I can't remember who exactly it was, but the quote more than anything stuck, which was that the most insidious thing about racism is it's an incredible distraction. It takes you away from what you should be or could be doing in life. It limits your fulfillment of your potential. And I think the patriarchy probably operates in a very similar way in a day-to-day basis for women. That's not to say that I'm not complicit, I don't enact it in certain ways. We forget ourselves, it's a constant work in progress. I'm not trying to be out here saying like, I've got it cracked, like everybody follow me. But more than anything, I think being mindful of these things is important, you know?
Also, what I'm hearing here as well is, it appears as if there's some sort of competition between levels of privilege. But the feminist claim is not that there is only subordination of men over women. It's more that they are adding another level of privilege to the game of subordination. And what's benefited from feminism is it took, like you mentioned, say the privilege of, say, the white privilege in white supremacist conversation, where it took the suffragette movement, it took until the suffragette movement to finally realize that women should be integrated into the category of women. And then it took second wave feminism to realize that in that category in women being included in the category of women, the women they were really referencing were white middle class women. And then you got intersectional feminism and then postmodern feminism. And I think what's being established now is that there is a form of an incorrect universal sort of man. Maybe the man that is subordinate to a woman isn't necessarily all forms of men. It's a category that doesn't quite capture every form of men. Because we can list a bunch of social identities which have competing privileges. I could list, say, let's talk about the indigenous Australian males. They struggle to exist in a world where they subordinate the women. So in that sense, the feminist critique would not apply in that instance. We could list able-bodied individuals. They exist with a certain level of privilege. We can list, say, racial privileges, and the list just goes on. It's no longer a question of which privilege is winning over which. It's more that these privileges are interchangeable, and there are instances when you might have an intersection of these privileges, and there are instances when one privilege outweighs another. But it's not a question of one being over the other, but more, how do these compete? It's a complex relationship is really what I'm trying to
Can I throw a question back at that?
I just wanted to make
jump in.
one point. I think you made a really interesting point about, I don't know the history of sexual violence of white men against black male slaves, but I think it'd be really interesting to pull apart, and the way I would think about that would be through the lens of sexism. And I think my understanding, I would be interested in the history, but predominantly the people who were on the end of that, of violence and sexual violence, would have been black women, but also black men would have been on the ends of that violence. And that would have been a way of dehumanizing those men further. And you know, why is it dehumanizing for a man to be penetrated? And that's because it's dehumanizing to be feminine, and that really ties into how we think about sexism. So that's how I don't see these oppressions as mutually exclusive. I see them actually as dependent on each other and interlinked. So I think that's why I would understand that.
Yeah, quickly before we move on, because you said some interesting things as well, and I think if from the stance you're taking, which is very valid and for all the reasons, but if there was, as going back to my initial question, if for example, I imagine that there's some anti-capitalist virtue in you, and there's anti. So, do you not see any benefit in trying to like come together on what we have in common as opposed to the differences? Because no doubt you're right, and there is some racism in white feminism or whatever. But where are you equally keen on trying to find some commonalities between men and women?
Yeah, well, I probably should have preempted everything by saying, which I briefly want to say in my introduction, but everyone did a short one, was that I think, yeah, definitely at the end of the day, listen, like, as black men, I know we're always fighting, yeah? I know as black women as well, I know you're always fighting as well. So it makes no sense for us to be doing the oppression Olympics, for us to be fighting each other. And I think that this is why I have a problem with a lot of the discussions at the moment in contemporary feminism. I think that a lot of the discussions lead to that. And I think, again, if we're talking about distractions, I think that is one. So yeah, I completely endorse a kind of a researched, logic-based approach to gendered issues for both men and for women, specifically for black men and for black women. That's what I'm speaking on behalf of. And I think if we're looking ultimately for black empowerment, that should be the team that we're all on. And so, yeah, of course, I think it's important for us to come together and look at these issues. And I think it's important for us to be critical of a lot of the things that are going on in the aim of black empowerment. And so I think that goes in hand with being critical of a lot of the current discussions around things like feminism or things like people who are discussing race at the moment, this sort of thing.
In the hope of improving it, sort of thing, as well.
In the hope of creating our own structures that correctly define us and that allow us to empower ourselves rather than anything else.
Yeah. Well, that's a nice segue to my next question, kind of. So I was going to say that as a prelude to my next question, bringing it back to some of like the facts and evidence as well, like you're saying, radical feminism argues that traditional gender roles are rooted in male dominance and female subordination. I think this is a fair statement when you look at like who holds economic and political power in the world. I think it's a fair statement when you analyze the dynamics of prostitution and pornography. I think it's a fair statement when you observe the language men use, like bitch, painting, as Stormzy would say, mankind. And it's a fair statement when you observe like a lot of the statistics of male violence against women. So what I'm interested in asking you, we've somewhat been answered a little bit, but what might be the benefits of men loosening their grip on the traditional male role that typically trains them for domination, and what might be the negatives of that?
So I first of all, kind of again, this goes back to my idea on this mimetic thesis that seems to be very prevalent in gender theory, that black men do mimic that traditional role. I think you've got a very interesting piece of research on that kind of subject, actually, because I think a lot of the time when we do kind of look into...
I'm talking as men in general, not specifically black men, but it's a good point.
That's all I can really speak from my point of view. So, but yeah, I'm not going to try and speak for white men, like I can't really do that. So what I can say is that I think a lot of the time if you're looking into the reality in which black men behave as fathers is quite different to the kind of stereotypes that exist in gender theory. Yeah, and I think I'm not 100% convinced that black men specifically do kind of all have that kind of traditional male role. I think there are a lot of kind of counter traditional male roles.
Yeah, and it's 100% important to acknowledge that not all men fit into the traditional male role at all. But does that take away from perhaps the majority or the large numbers who do fit into the role of, I said, do black men not use prostitution or pornography? Do they not say negative, derogatory terms to women? Do you know what I'm saying? I mean, that's I don't.
I think to follow up on your question, I think a good way to think about it is that by taking our hands off it, by easing up on the performance of masculinity, because masculinity is an incredibly hard thing to maintain at all times, in terms of achieving a kind of a desired or hegemonic masculinity, as it's often referred to. By taking our hands kind of off the steering wheel a little bit, it could probably be quite a liberating feeling. You could just be yourself in whatever form you come out, and not being worried that someone's going to call you a pussy, or not being worried that somebody's going to tell you to man up, or whatever form that takes. I think that could be quite a liberating thing. It's interesting to think, apologies that my examples always take me to the Caribbean, but that's where my mind seems to be in these like long, well, it's been hot at the moment, but generally speaking, the rest of the time, that's where my mind usually is, you know? But in Haiti, it's popular, and there's a really, really interesting article on this. In Haiti, it's popular at carnival time that the biggest hardback man will dress up as women and cross-dress during carnival. And not just that they'll dress in women's attire, but they'll act in a very flamboyant and sexualized, effeminate manner. And carnival, in terms of the theories of it, is often seen as the moment when you get to kind of let off steam, you get to let loose, you get to be completely free. Carnival has almost been described as freedom itself. It's a little pocket of a couple of days, 3 days, 2.5 days, thereabouts, depending on how early you wake up on Juve. But it's 2.5 days of complete freedom, or as much freedom as you can access. And so why is it, in a context like the Caribbean, where you've got all of these kinds of histories of gendered oppression, where men are kind of receiving particular ideas of what it means to be a man, have come from the brutal side of the plantation where you've got this incredible violence, why is it that they need that so much? That would be my main question. Why is it that in gendered terms you need to be able to perform the freest, most flamboyant version of yourself? In Mardi Gras, for example, to take it to another context, the Mardi Gras Indians, who are incredibly well-respected men within their communities, the main thing that they'll say when a Mardi Gras Indian meets his competitor, and they're dressed in these incredible headdresses, these huge, I guess people have probably seen them, right? These huge headdresses. The best thing that one Mardi Gras Indian can say to another when they meet face to face is to tell him that he looks pretty. That's the interesting thing, right? During Carnival, there's a possibility, there's a space to be able to free up on the kind of the tight grip of masculinity a little bit. So I'd kind of say that maybe that's one of the main kind of benefits of taking ourselves away from these normative ideals, these ideals of what a man should be in the kind of the hardest back sense, and just kind of be a little bit more free. And I know for me, when I'm able to do that, it's kind of, it feels all right. It's like the house doesn't come burning down, like, you know what I mean? You don't get kind of, your friends don't ostracize. You might say a dumb thing or something considered dumb from some perspective.
You once said there was a fear of, a previous event, you said there was a fear of breaking a solidarity in the group, and I thought is that perhaps a negative? If you suddenly come out with all of these stuff, like, oh, you don't have to be a man, why are you calling girls pussies, is that, or men pussies even, is that somehow breaking like the solidarity amongst your friendship group, and can that ostracize you from a male, like quite a masculine, heavy friendship group? So maybe that's a negative. I don't know if you think.
Yeah, I mean, maybe at a younger stage in my life, I feel like most of my friendship group, or a lot of the guys I associate with now, and that's not just people who've had the same access to university or anything like that. I feel like generally that doesn't quite happen as much as I remember when I was like 14 or 15. But I think for a lot of younger members of the audience, that might be something which you'd face, and that's something which you kind of, that's a dilemma which hopefully an event like this kind of sets this, like plants the seed of next time you find yourself in a scenario like that, when you're thinking like, when everybody's referring to the gal as a ting, and everybody's referring to it, and you wonder, well, why is it that this girl is a thing? Why is it that she's an object? But then also it might just be that you want to sing along with your favorite track. So I think sometimes we have to have a tight grip. Sometimes we have to let go, and because you're negotiating each of these situations in life, right? I'm not saying that the feminist adage is that the revolution starts at home, right? So the revolution does start at home, but you don't have to be a revolutionary at all times. But it's good for your mind to be on at all times, because you can kind of be taken for a fool sometimes.
I just want to, I'm going to draw a parallel between the females in the US, black females that are working in communities, and I'm going to try and wheel it back. So it's going to sound like I'm not answering a question, but I'm going to wheel it back. So I'll do it. It was Patricia Hill Collins who talks about how feminists are they haven't really appreciated what the black females in impoverished environments have been doing in promoting feminism. And it's been simple. They've just been providing role models on the personal level. So they've been helping out in communities in terms of well-being and in terms of health. But in doing this, what has happened is they've created a new form of expression of feminism. It no longer becomes feminism through political means, but it becomes feminism through instances of the family feminism through, just think of like the big mama in the environment, in the community, where she has played such a big role in sort of wheeling back, say black youth from being on the streets, for example. And now to bring that back to how this applies to men's role, is in sort of breaking from the normative claims of the patriarchy. What you do is you identify with a new form of expression. You are fulfilling your feminist role by meeting a wider audience. For instance, like you are able to provide a role model for, say, the many siblings that you have. You might be able to provide a good role model for all of your friends. You might be able, like the example with the Mardi Gras, or not the Mardi Gras, sorry, the Haitians. That's a good case where that really big guy might be seen as like a great role model for, say, the 7-year-old or the 10-year-old that might be dealing with these socializations into these normative values. And so it's as simple as that. Just be a role model. That's all I have to say.
Sorry. Yeah, I had a thought. I think what you said is very interesting about in Haiti, people being able to do that sort of thing in terms of men being able to kind of let go of that, that masculinity for a little while, and be vulnerable, essentially. That's what we're talking about. I think what we shouldn't forget is that if we're talking about black men in the UK, say, and the majority who are, as mentioned, at the bottom of a lot of social denominators, if we consider the system that we're in to be a system of white supremacy, and we consider black people to be under a state of attack in a lot of different ways pretty consistently, then it's hard, if you imagine a black man as a victim of all these circumstances and you consider black male vulnerability, it's then hard to make yourself more vulnerable. And I think we have to remember that we are in a system which is constantly persecuting us, a lot of the time for being black men. There's a particular form of gendered racism, and I think maybe makes it harder for a lot of young black boys to let go of that kind of masculinity. And that can actually help you get through in these kind of situations. We had a conversation with Vince the other day who mentioned that some of the things that are called toxic masculinity might actually be seen as necessary survival skills in a certain environment.
So yeah, I'd agree with that. I think especially for young men, in terms of, if we're asking young men to be vulnerable in extremely challenging material conditions of poverty, poor education systems, that's a real challenge to ask that of young men. The only other thing that I'd add in terms of, I think, and I welcome if people identify from this community and they want to add to this, I think people who really push the extremes of queer communities and queer communities of colour, they really face a lot of shame and violence from other communities. I think that can be the consequence of pushing these boundaries far. So I think, there is the opportunity, it can be a sense of freedom for certain men, but then for certain men, it can cost them their lives if they push the boundaries too far. So
I will open it up to you guys very soon. You're being very patient. Thank you. Just on that, because that's a very strong point I think you're making there. Is there very briefly? Is there some sort of solution to that in your mind that might? Because
yes,
for sure we have to be tough. So there you go. Okay, perfect.
Yes.
Cool. Moving on.
my solution, because if we're talking about, as mentioned, a system that keeps black people under attack, then my solution is to address those issues. And I think then, because the reason I said Haiti is interesting is when we're talking about Haiti, we're talking about an island that was able to liberate itself, at least geographically, from white supremacy, right? So they might have a whole host of other debts and sanctions, etc., laid upon them, but in some kind of spiritual, in some sort of sense, they were able to liberate themselves, and then maybe they were able to have that kind of freedom to be more vulnerable. And so I think that's the solution if we're looking to evolve beyond that sort of thing.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So I'd like to speak to that. I think that's where we come to the challenge of why, should black men embrace feminism? If you think about the things that are really going to help black men in terms of improved access to high quality education, reforming the criminal justice system, access to the housing market and job market, those those opportunities for black men aren't always on the feminist agenda that are presented. They're often on the radical feminist agenda. But if you're saying those things, if you're articulating things, then black men might get on board. So those issues need to be spoken about in line with racism and sexism when we talk about radicalism. Yeah.
Great points. My last question, before we open it up to you guys, but this question I guess can kind of be to you guys as well. But in light of the Harvey Weinstein fuckery, I'd quite like to discuss what is often called rape culture by radical feminism. And if that term triggers you, you can kind of call it a culture of sexual intrusion. It's very hard to deny that we live in a culture of sexual intrusion. If you listen to the accounts of women, the frequency of some form of sexual intrusion that they've experienced in their lives, and the fact that taking precautions against rape is not unusual for women. The fact that rape is largely unreported, and the fact that there are grey areas in sexual encounters that are hard to categorize as either consensual or non-consensual. So one thing, slightly unrelated to what we've been talking about, but on this point, are we advancing the cause of ending men's violence against women by focusing only on acts legally defined as rape? A bit loaded, yeah, a bit loaded. But an important question.
I thought we were I thought the idea with rape culture is by emphasizing to not just focus on acts legally defined as rape. So it's acts.
So that's why I'm asking you. So
Okay, so I think, yes, you're correct, because there are, for instance, studies which show that the act of objectifying a woman has a completely different interplay, a different process when it comes to perception, where the woman is genuinely being perceived as an object. And I think in recognizing these instances, what we have a role to do is really to just participate in morally permissible objectification, for instance, whether it be acts which are consensual or acts which are mutual. But on top of that, when it comes to rape culture, we also need to recognize that there is a large amount of male victims that participate in, that suffer rape. I think the statistic was 40% of rape victims in 2017 were all male. And so we need to recognize that the people that actually are suffering from
probably in the prison system, right?
Not just in the prison system.
Okay.
This is male on male. It's just something that isn't really talked about. And so I think the really shocking thing about rape culture is that it applies to both forms of gender. And yeah, you mentioned earlier, D-Dash, that males don't really, you're just not really going to find stories of male victims during rape culture because they're just not really comfortable in talking about it. There's like another level of like masculinity which is broken down from that instance.
Just careful as well, because I think a lot of women don't report rape as well.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, my generalization was not, maybe it suggested it, but it wasn't made in comparison to how females...
So I know you are comparing it, yeah. But specifically, because I'm not denying this culture of violence does, men are hurt in violence, like most violence is done by men on men, no doubt. But specifically, I mean, there's a serious conversation that needs to be had when there's people like Harvey Weinstein in this world, and whether trying to isolate him as like an evil figure, as like a single standalone man who's a bad man, as opposed to taking a longer hard look at some of the ways men have been socialized in their upbringings. It's detrimental if we don't look at the socialization process, I think.
Yeah, I suppose the only thing I'd add is I think as a culture, especially working with young men and with young people in general, we need to think about how we talk to young people about relationships, how we talk to young people about sex, how we talk about love. And I think as a culture, we're not very good at talking about those things. And that is the opposite of a rape culture, is a culture that talks about, mutually loving and caring relationships. And I don't think we do that enough. And I think that's the flip side. And I think that's what we need to talk about. We need to talk to, so that's something I do in my day job, is talk to young people about what is pleasure, how do you enjoy sex, and I think those are important conversations that need to be had.
Is anybody in the audience familiar with Junot Diaz, by show of hands? And is anyone familiar with what's going on with Junot Diaz at the moment? By show of hands again? Sorry, that came across like it was a pop quiz test or something. But yeah, so Junot Diaz, for those who don't know, is a Hispanic American, Puerto Rican or from the Dominican Republic? Dominican Republic, thank you. So he's from the Dominican Republic, but he lives and grew up in the US. Now, at the moment, he's embroiled in a scandal that's somewhat similar in terms of from the outside of the package, looks similar to the Harvey Weinstein thing. But when you delve into it, it's a little bit more complex than that, because there are a lot of people who, so there's an accusation that he made some kind of lecherous kind of approaches, advances on a colleague, and he works within a university setting. So he's a writer, writes about the Dominican Republic, writes some beautiful novels, and he became a kind of a champion, almost like the poster boy of the Hispanic Americans, essentially, but particularly those from the Caribbean. And so he was almost like their hero in a way. And then these allegations came out, and then he kind of got embroiled in one of these scandals, and then there was an attempt to kind of discontinue some of his books. He was writing a children's book and all these kind of different things. But with that, there was a real gray area around consent, and then also he'd just about 2 months earlier written a piece where he spoke about his own experience of being sexually abused as a child. And so one person took that or one commentator took that as a kind of a cover-up. He was seeing that these allegations were about to come out, but there wasn't actually, as far as I understand it, and I'd want you to read it for yourself, there wasn't actually any concrete evidence of any kind of physical violence that was done to the person, but more that it was a kind of a question of ambiguous consent. There was a line that on the part of the individual that he'd crossed. And so it kind of sparked this kind of important conversation, is that are we willing to confront those kinds of questions within our community? Are we willing to confront them when it comes to our heroes? When it comes to Bill Cosby, it's kind of the evidence was nothing you can say, do you know what I mean? Bill Cosby, from all kind of understanding, pretty much did what happened, and it was pretty kind of disgusting. It was across a series of years. But when you get to these kind of gray area instances, it becomes something which really forces us to interrogate our own ideas about what consent is, about how men and female engage with each other, whether there's the possibility for a kind of like a sexualized play that's humorous and intimate, but that also doesn't violate any boundaries. In the Caribbean, it seems to be much more possible. In a British context, the idea of kind of flirtatiously interacting between male and female is sometimes seen as an advance. And so it's context specific as well. I'm not really getting us any closer to kind of clear and concrete Twitter style answers, but I think that's the nature of the problem. It just kind of forces us to think and interrogate quite closely.
Yeah. Does anyone have anything to say from the audience? Okay, we've got a couple, and I'm very glad that it's women who have put their hands up. We've got mics ready. I think that's a really interesting point. Yeah, I think context is very key.
So when I came to uni, I found myself surrounded by loads of like middle-class white women who are privileged, and I made a friend with one who was quite a strong feminist, and I found it really difficult talking to her about feminism because she was so passionate about it, and it's something that means a lot to me, but the struggles that we had were so different, and being a black woman, I felt like there was another level of complexity to my feminism than there was to hers. Stuff like how, black women's bodies, I feel like, are very, very sexualized, and just that extra layer of struggle. And it just became difficult talking to her because I don't want to be like, yeah, I've got it worse than you, but I don't want to kind of delegitimize her struggle, but I also want her to say, yeah, you kind of have got it worse. So how do we kind of collaborate or come to a common ground so we're all working towards a common goal, as opposed to kind of like, we're both running the race and she's had like a 10-second head start. I just kind of want your guys' opinion on how we can kind of be on the same level so all of us can kind of get together and fight towards the same cause.
Do you want to quickly respond to that? And then there's someone behind you who wants to ask a question as well.
Yeah, I don't want to.
Sorry. Are we jumping straight?
Yeah, might as well.
I would take this dialogue as the starting point. And I think one very, very simple thing that I've learned is that often it's useful to listen before you speak. And I don't mean that on your part, I mean that on the part of your friend in many instances. it's a shame maybe that she's not in that spare seat next to you now to begin that conversation, you know? But I think that's the part, that's our role to play as well when we're coming to this conversation about feminism, is that because I've read one or two things about feminism doesn't make me an expert and feel like, okay, I've got it now, I can kind of put that over there and work on something which I find more interesting. It's a kind of an ongoing contemplation that you need to continually kind of reflect on and meditate on and take your time with, you know? I'm preaching to the choir. Again, it would be good if she was occupying that seat. In terms of thinking through these a little bit more, and as a teacher, I'm annoying because I send people home with things to read. But Hazel V. Carby wrote a wonderful piece called White Women Listen. Something in the limits of womanhood. If you put in Carby and White Women Listen, that'll come up. And that might speak to your experience quite kind of vividly. And she's pretty much said exactly what you said, but using a host of different examples and kind of opening up that dialogue in terms of a kind of a broader understanding of feminism. One other point on that, also Alice Walker as well, so her definition of a womanist. Some women of color don't feel comfortable with the label of feminist because they don't feel like it's inclusive of them. It feels like they're a kind of a add-on, like the little bit that you buy kind of extra to go with your kind of your PlayStation game when you go through certain, do you know what I mean, certain levels or whatever. They feel like they're a kind of an appendage to the thing rather than it being their own. So the womanist concept for them is more embracing in some instances. And she defines womanism as being what purple is to lavender. So it's a quality of it, but it doesn't tell the full story. You know, it's kind of the womanist experience isn't the feminist experience. They're two slightly different things, but they're related and they can be in conversation.
Yeah, I think I agree with what you're saying entirely there in terms of, for me personally, I think if you look historically, feminism has never really been something used to uplift black women. I think it's not catered for black women for the reasons that you just mentioned. And so, as you just pointed out, Alice Walker, I think that's a great example. And there are a lot of examples of people doing things that are examining what it means to be a black woman and the kind of particular gendered racism that you experience that aren't necessarily under that umbrella of feminism. And I think another one of the things that is kind of pernicious with feminism and black women is that a lot of the time, the kind of black women are used as a kind of loudspeaker to kind of get some issues and points across, and you can kind of hijack some of the narratives that black women might experience to forward feminism. But then when it comes to that working the other way around, it doesn't often seem to go that way. So yeah.
Is there any black women that want to respond to that in the audience at all, or any other questions from anybody? Don't be shy. We're all a family here. Just throw it.
So this is like sort of on the same sort of vein on thinking about access, like how everybody can sort of be accessing feminist movement, really. And I apologise if this is too specific a question to sort of be of worth to people. But I'm a teacher in Bristol, and teaching speech writing to my class as an English teacher. And I noted to my class that in pretty much every single list of greatest speeches that I found, it was all white men, and like 200 years old white men who were all speaking. So then I just commented on that, and I said, I'm going to show us one by Michelle Obama, because she's a great speaker. And based on that decision, a boy in my class wrote a speech basically slamming me for being a man-hater. And I think it's just, I think it's interesting, like when you spoke about the sort of, like young men sort of being ostracized for these kind of for feminist opinions, or criticizing their friends for having any like slightly sexist sort of opinions. And I wonder how, as a teacher, I feel like it is my responsibility to educate on this, how I respond to that as a woman, and he's a man. I don't know how the access should sort of be given to him, and also like, sort of secondly,
give him a detention.
Yeah.
Sorry. No,
it's interesting you say that, because I tried really hard to give him detention, and my school didn't support me in it, so wasn't allowed to give him detention. But I also think, like, and what you said about semantics, and sort of like saying we shouldn't really be semantically thinking about the word feminism. Do you think it would be helped if it wasn't called feminism? Do you think if we removed the semantics, we called it something like genderism, would it be more accessible to men, to boys? And so kind of two questions there. How do I make this accessible to a young boy who I teach? And do you think it would help?
Yeah, can I respond? I think really, really good points. In answer to the first one, I think that this is why I think this is important, because I think, unfortunately, because of the prejudices in men and how they've been socialized, if they were to hear another man say something like, you lot need to check Michelle Obama or whatever, I think there's something in that, and I think there's something about men listening to other men. Like for me personally, it's like I've been reading a lot of like the feminist theory, and I've like from bell hooks and people like that, and I found it interesting. But then when I came across a man writing literature about feminism, it immediately connected to me a lot more. And I feel like one of the key things for affecting like the youth and young males is that if it's coming from more men, these ideas behind feminism, I think that could be a powerful thing. And on the thing about changing the name of feminism, because I had this discussion earlier as well, and I think I'm slightly reluctant about the idea, because I feel that there is so much work that's already been put into what is called feminism. So there's so many books on feminism, so much really brilliant work on feminist theory, that it would feel unfair to suddenly just strip that away and give it a different title. I think, as D-Dash and a few others have said, we need to try and figure out a way to educate people and teach them about, or push feminism to become more incorporating of things like racism and white supremacy, and really push that to try and make it as wholesome as possible, because I think at the moment it doesn't feel that way. And I'm also worried as well about this left-right thing going on at the moment, and this like you mentioned man-hating, and this like, I think that's gone a bit wild, and I really think we need some people in the middle trying to calm that all down, quite frankly. Any of you want to respond to that? And then
it's all very complex terrain, in my opinion. And I think when it comes to feminism, it's closely tied to identity. And identity itself is a complex concept. You've got self-identity, you identify with other subjects, you've got the identity that people perceive you as. So it would make sense that when it comes to, it would make sense that you would find yourself identifying to, say, Robert Jensen when it comes to understanding feminism, and you specifically. And so it seems like you just need to pick your battles. Like, you need to, for instance, the girl who spoke about, the first speaker who spoke about her white friend, you've got to test the terrain. You've really just got to drop a little idea, see what happens. Drop another little idea, see what happens. And you've really got to figure out how people are responding to your ideas, because you are dealing with not just complex philosophy, but also the complex relation between identity. And that's why it's also difficult.
Yeah, it's almost like it shouldn't be your emotional labor to do that. But I think if you value her enough as a friend, or if you think it's a good enough investment of your time to do that, I think it's worth doing it. Especially if you feel like that person could become a kind of a good kind of supporter of the thing, you know? Like if you think she's going to back it, then why not kind of take the time to have her as a kind of a support in that sense? I think.
What about your thoughts on the stuff about man hating and the young boys? You work with young boys.
I think I really struggle to, I feel your pain, basically. It's hard to get these concepts across to young men, and I think older men need to step up and be good role models. I think it's a step-by-step process, and hopefully it's that's his first experience, and maybe he'll go away and reflect on it, and it can happen. And then in terms of, I think there's two different things between how do you take an idea towards the masses, and then feminism as itself. And my understanding of feminism comes from what I understand the politics of black empowerment to be, and I wouldn't change the name of that or water that down at all, in terms of, because for me I grew into that experience at uni when I was reading all these thinkers like Frantz Fanon, Du Bois, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and for me that was a really powerful experience, and it was the first time that I was like, these people are speaking from my experience, and so it was really powerful for me. Those politics are no way perfect, or they're they're really important and they're really great, but they're not perfect. And I don't think the politics of feminism is perfect, but it's the voices of women, which are voices which have been marginalized in society for forever, basically. So I don't think we should water it down and take it away, basically.
Cool, and I think on that, because we've run slightly over, we will bring it to an end. And I think my last points, I think this has been like really healthy, and I'm actually glad that we didn't actually fight, because I was a bit worried. But yeah, I think my last point is just to wrap it up. I think a couple things just important for men in particular to understand about feminism, or the thoughts behind feminism, or like the thoughts we've been discussing, is that a lot of men might want to adopt some feminist theory or whatever in the hope of saving women, being that knight in shining armor, and that in itself is a problematic role. And I think it's very important, to my quote at the beginning by Dworkin, that really it's about trying to regain some kind of humanity. I think that's an important thing. I also think about there's this argument made by Robert Jensen, about shame versus guilt, and I think that guilt can sometimes be a positive thing. So if there are elements of guilt you sometimes feel in your interactions with women, or how women are treated in society, similar with race, if you're white and you have some kind of guilt, that guilt can be a positive thing. Like I think we attach a lot of negativity to it, but I think guilt can be a positive thing, and you should let it be a positive thing that can perhaps like stimulate change in your everyday life and whatnot. Be brave. I'm going to try and dedicate a bit of my studies to gender next year, but can we just get a massive round of applause for the panel and all of you as well?